All right, so we're all set up, and as you can see, today's topic is not a happy one by any stretch. It's dismal, and I think when we face situations like we're facing with the recent mass killings in
I I don't know why I
Texas
can't do this forever.
and Buffalo, we have to balance on the one hand the kind of
Let me try.
heartbreaking grief that we do feel as we look at the faces of these young children with what we should also feel, which is outrage at the conditions that have gotten us here, and true urgency to do something, whatever we can do, that is constructive to reduce the frequency of these mass killings in our society and their spiraling, spreading contagious effects. Because if you have dealings with young children, if you have dealings with teachers these days, you know it's not just the individuals who are directly affected, it is everyone else of that age or in that situation that ends up fearing it could have been me, it might be me next. Having said all of that, I will also say immediately right off the bat that I don't think there's anything much we can do about the availability of guns, which is the primary problem. Not only because there are so many circulating in our society right now that even if we were to instantaneously turn off the spigot, pass meaningful gun reform legislation, gun control legislation tomorrow, it would still be a generation or two before we were able to clean up all of the guns in our society. But it is also the case that I think the possibility of gun reform passing the Senate and then being upheld by the Supreme Court is also vanishingly small. And so we have to look at this, I think, from a broader context. If we can't get the guns out of people's hands, what else can we do? And that's going to lead me to concentrate on other factors, the mental health crisis that is sweeping young people in the United States today, in addition to the level of vitriol and violence that has become ubiquitous both in social media and more mainstream politics as places where we might be able to gain a little bit more traction than on actual gun control. I'll start with the images just to commemorate for a moment the people who've been lost. And of course, you're aware there was also a shooting in a church in California in between the shooting in Buffalo that was racially motivated and racially targeted, reflecting neo-fascist and neo-Nazi ideas, the great replacement theory, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the lecture. And then brace yourself, the images of these young children and their teachers who were lost just a few days ago in Uvalde, Texas. And I can't look at these images and not see the kids I went to school with, my son, my nephews and nieces. It's truly heartbreaking, right? And while I don't want to dwell on this, I think there's almost a kind of pornography of violence that sometimes surrounds these events. We also need to not be numb to it, right? And each one of these children is an individual who has parents, who has siblings, who has grandparents. You may have heard that the husband of one of the teachers had a heart attack a day later and also died. By the way, that there does appear to be a direct kind of heart attack that is caused by loneliness and grief and stress and so it's, I think in a sense we might say this was yet another casualty. And we do need to stay focused on the fact that this is individual by individual a epidemic of gun violence that occurs daily in our country, 54 times a week, right? And so let us not be numb at the same time that we protect ourselves from the emotional impact of dealing with the death of children in our midst. All right. So having spent a moment on the concrete individuals, I'm going to move very quickly away from them into three related issues. The first is uh, not only why there are too many guns in our society and how that relates to the epidemic of violence, but also why public policy is blocked on this issue. And that I hope will be illuminating of broader political issues that we should be discussing. I then will pivot to the youth mental health crisis, which is, I think, a different angle to come at this from. I think it's worthwhile remembering that at least the killing in Texas does not appear to be racially motivated. It just appears to be a truly sick, desperate young man. And that there is at this moment in our society a great deal of mental illness among young people and a crisis in terms of our capacity to handle it, to even know what to do about it. And this would be a more constructive place, it seems to me, to be focusing our energy at the moment. And then finally thinking about the toxic political environment that we inhabit at the moment, especially in the dark reaches of the web and the social media ecosystems, in which disinformation, conspiracy theory, and calls to violence circulate widely and readily without any real regulation. It's a kind of toxic anarchy online right now. And it, again, when you combine that with the ready availability of guns in our society, is no surprise that we are having incident after incident, just a drumbeat of violence taking far too many lives. If we can't control the guns, perhaps we should turn instead to controlling the source of motivation for some of these incidents. So, starting briefly with the guns, and again, I think that the diagram that is most illuminating is the one that shows us a comparative perspective and shows the clear correlation between the number of guns per capita and the number of gun homicides per capita. Please note that the United States, right, has 4 or 5 times the number of guns per capita of even our nearest competitors in the developed world. And we have 4 or 5 times the amount of gun homicides. It seems a pretty easy connection to draw. To take an analogy, we live in a historical moment where refined sugar, where processed food, where saturated fats have become more available than they have ever been in human history. They're the cheapest source of calories in our diet today. We have an obesity epidemic. It's not hard to connect the dots. You make something readily available and people will take it and use it, and that includes the side effects. This is what's happening with guns. The second thing to see, and again, I think this is extraordinarily important in just analyzing and entering this debate, is that the majority of gun deaths in our society are suicides, not homicides. This is the leading cause of death now for people under the age of 24. Right? Just think about that for a moment. Gun death is the leading cause of death for young people, and it's dominantly suicides. The people who die are people who turn the guns on themselves. It's an awful lot of unintentional killings among the homicides. It's a very small portion of these deaths that are related to defensive uses, right? And this then helps us to understand these guns are used accidentally. They're used by children under 11 years old who don't know what they're doing. They're just playing. They're used by people who are desperately sad or depressed at the moment. If they didn't have a gun, they would probably get through it. But when lethal means are readily available, they will be used. And we can see then comparing mass shootings, right? And we know that the United Kingdom had one in Scotland in 1996, and they said, let's get rid of the handguns. And that was the only one they had. We know that there's a similar story for Australia and a similar story for Norway. They have one incident. By the way, conservative governments in this society resist the hunting lobby and ban the lethal weapons, and then these events don't occur again. Please look at the disparity there for just a moment. Again, when we look at how many homicides involve guns in the United States, which has by far and away the highest homicide rate of the countries we compare ourselves, nearly 80% of our homicides involve guns. The next nearest country is less than half that amount. The UK, with rigorous gun controls, has only 4%. When we begin to look at the underlying trends, one of the things we can see is that on the one hand, the rate of gun purchases has ticked up steadily this century, where it started at around 600,000 guns being sold per month. It is now up to over 1 million guns being sold per month. And what you can see is these big spikes, right? After Obama's reelection and Sandy Hook, when Obama is first elected during the coronavirus pandemic. And so either situations of social change, rapid social change, the first African American being elected, the sense that maybe this country is changing rapidly and maybe people will not be able to gain access to guns, or a violent school shooting occurs and people worry that maybe a little bit of momentum will build for gun control, people buy more guns, right? And on the other hand, it's worthwhile noting that if we go back to the 1960s, we're at a place where basically 50% of American households owned guns. We're right a more rural society at that time, but also a society in which more individuals have been in the military. By the time we get to the present moment, we're down in the low 40% of households owning guns. And the clear implication of this is that you have fewer people owning more guns. That's the nature of the situation we're in. When we look at public opinion about this, I'm going to start with the long-term, more stable trends, and then we'll get into the immediate aftermath of what happened in Texas. And what you can see is that from the 1990s to the present, there has always been a majority in favor of more strict gun control, or at least almost always, but the size of that majority has fluctuated from 3/4 to 2/3 to 50% of the population. Those who want things to stay where they are roughly 1/3 of the population with some variation, and then a stable roughly 10% who want less or no regulations. Now, when we get into the data on the current moment, I think it's quite striking. And this is more granular, more questions being asked. This is a political morning consult poll that was conducted just over the last few days. And what we see is that on the one hand, a large majority, right? 90% of Americans are in favor of background checks on all gun sales, right? And please note that it's very rare to get 90% of Americans in favor of anything, let alone 90% who are basically bipartisan. The division between Democrats and Republicans is very small here. Similarly, expand mental health screening up in the high 80s and no big partisan gap. Ban sales to people who are deemed dangerous by a mental health provider, very high percentages. Now, when we get down to things like um, banning assault weapons for people under 21, we're still seeing a substantial bipartisan majority. We get then down to ban high capacity ammunition magazines, the partisan divide starts to open up. Similarly, with just banning assault style weapons or firearms from school and college campuses. The reason it seems to me that the opinion is so uniform here is in part that we're in the immediate aftermath, not only of what happened in Texas, but also what happened in Buffalo. And on the other hand, that there's a clear uptick in gun violence in the United States as a whole, right? And so we have here on the one hand, the right number of school shootings hitting an all-time high last year. And then in addition to that, right, we're on pace, unfortunately, for another record year this year. And then when we look at the overall rate of active shooter incidents, not just in schools, again, steady increases to very high numbers, right? And so this seems to me to create the possibility of a scenario, right, where public opinion is clearly on the side of some regulation. We could talk about the idea of background checks. We could talk about red flag laws that say basically if somebody has been deemed a threat to themselves and others, they cannot get weapons or their weapons can be taken away from them. And then finally, banning specific kinds of weapons or ammunition magazines of the kind most likely to be used in one of these incidents. Having said all of that, I don't think, frankly, that stable public opinion in favor of this is going to be sufficient to get the legislation passed, even when it is underpinned by these kinds of trends, because the institutional impediments to it are too strong. And the first institutional impediment is the Senate. And we've talked about this numerous times before. The Senate is strongly more conservative in terms of its partisan and ideological lean than the country as a whole, right? It's really not representative of broad-based popular opinion. And that has to do with the very clear over-representation of rural and ex-urban areas, which if you look at the number of senators representing that area, it's almost those areas, it's almost 2/3 of the Senate, whereas more than 50% of the US population is either urban or suburban, and they get only a little bit less than 40% of the representation in the Senate. We add to this the fact that we have millions of dollars per year, tens of millions of dollars per year being spent by the gun lobby to sway the Senate, but also to sway the people who elect senators. And I want to be as clear as possible about this, right? We can demonize particular senators, but in a sense, they are only doing their job. They will not be re-elected if they vote for any kind of gun control, because their constituencies contain significant numbers of single issue voters, people who, if they vote for gun control, will vote for somebody else in the primary, will never vote for them again. At least that's the common sense, and it seems that the senators from the states that are strong pro-gun states are not willing to test the common sense, right? And to be as clear as possible, we'll get into this in a moment, there is meaningful, real gun culture in those states in which people really identify strongly as gun owners, see this as integral to who they are. Acquiring a gun from a parent is a really important rite of passage. Being trusted to use it is an indication of maturity and agency, and it is also integrated into a political identity in which it is a guarantor of individual freedom. We'll drill down on that in a moment, but that's right, the baseline that makes it really impossible to envision the Senate passing meaningful reform or gun control legislation. And when we look into then where that overrepresentation of rural areas come from, I know we've talked about this before, right? There's a strong overrepresentation of white people without college education, a small overrepresentation of white people with college educations, and then basically an underrepresentation of everyone else relative to their proportion of the population. This is a product of the arbitrary containers of states and the geographic sorting of the American population along racial and ideological lines at the state level. One, I think, very graphic way to see this is that 62 senators currently represent a quarter of the US population. Please note that 6 senators also represent a quarter of the population. So these states are represented 10 times as effectively as these more urban states. And right, the result is, of course, in a Senate with the filibuster, all you need is 40 people, 40 senators to block legislation. Basically, 15–20% of the American population can block meaningful gun control legislation. And so I think this is an insurmountable impediment to effective gun control legislation at the moment. But even if it weren't, even if the heartbreak of the next and the next and the next incident eventually convinces the senators to act, there is a second and extremely important impediment, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. I'm actually getting ready to give a whole class on what's happening with the Constitution and the Supreme Court. And as you are probably aware, right, the Heller decision from 2008 basically transformed the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which protects the right of militias and hence the right to bear arms. But it was transformed in 2008 into an individual right to possess firearms in ways that seem difficult to reconcile with the actual text of the Second Amendment. And the author of that opinion is Antonin Scalia. I've got this image of him here in what I would call a laughing originalist pose. And I call him that because this is so far from originalism that it's almost a joke. I see I've got a question, so I am going to stop for a moment and we'll come right back to this. But was it Wilma? Yeah, Wilma, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, there's a mistaken belief in what the fact something is a protected individual right means. They believe that, I heard a senator say that, the Second Amendment trumps any effort at gun control, totally trumps it, because you have a right to bear arms. And they don't understand that we have a right to free speech, but that doesn't mean it's unregulated. everyone agrees there's a time, place, and manner, but they believe that the Second Amendment gives them an unlimited right with no right to regulate any phase of it. And it's that ignorance and that point of view that is one of the major stumbling blocks now to a rational approach to gun control.
And I think you may be generous, Wilma, in calling it ignorance. I think the alternative vocabulary I prefer would be to call it ideology. And that's in a sense where I'm going with this analysis, is that there's an effort to weaponize rights discourse against things stably supported by a majority of Americans that is part of this effort to, in a sense, take what was one of the most effective mechanisms for progressive political change, making arguments in terms of constitutional rights, and use them as a double-edged sword in exactly the opposite direction right now. And I think that this is then worth discussing for a few minutes, but I think the first thing to see, I'm not sure who exactly, did you say Ted Cruz? There was the senator who
No,
made
it was some senator whose name I don't know and didn't recognize.
Okay, because there are various people who are making these claims in this historical moment. I think Cruz is among them. But having said that, I'm not convinced that they don't understand that constitutional rights aren't absolute rights, but they're persuaded, or at least have decided that it's strategically a good approach to take to say that this is a slippery slope, that any effort to regulate guns at all means that eventually guns will be taken away from everyone, right? And that is obviously not true. We regulate all kinds of rights and entitlements. And on the other hand, it is politically expedient because it motivates a lot of people to vote as if people are coming to take their guns away. I think I've told you this story before. On a flight from New York to California, stopping in Dallas, I sat next to a gun dealer from Arkansas in the buildup to the 2016 election. And we had a political discussion, and he was quite frank about the fact that he was voting for Donald Trump because if Hillary Clinton were elected, it wouldn't be long until the United Nations and the federal government were coming to take everybody's guns away. He believed that, right? And so that there is this view out there that is circulating, effective, getting people to vote. And this is part of the broader gun culture as well as legal culture that I want to now discuss for a moment. So thank you for calling that to our attention, Wilma. And without disagreeing with you, I do want to say that in a sense, that's the people who are making those absolutist claims know better, but nevertheless find it to their advantage to make those claims. So I want to drill down on this for a moment. And I'm drawing at the moment on Adam Winkler's work, which is a long history of the transformation that led eventually to the Heller decision. Law review article by Reva Siegel, which was published. She's a Yale Law School professor, published in the immediate aftermath of the Siegel decision, and then some more recent law scholarship as well. And what Winkler and Siegel help us to see is, and the reason I've got the iconic image of Ruby Bridges being escorted by federal marshals to school in Louisiana in the aftermath of the Brown v. Board decision, is that Winkler and Siegel show, I think quite persuasively, that this is really the beginning of modern gun culture, contemporary gun culture, is the sense that the federal government that many states had been able to trust not to meddle in their politics for the first half of the 20th century, all of a sudden got very involved in overturning Jim Crow, segregation, disenfranchisement, later in promoting equal rights for women, later in constitutionalizing the legal right to gay marriage, and more recently in encouraging rights to gender freedom or freedom of gender expression, right? And that if the federal government becomes an agent of undoing more conservative policy, you might say racist, sexist, homophobic policy at the state level, individuals have to be able to effectively resist federal policy if they find it to be an overreach or tyrannical. And so the idea, which is admittedly a very old idea in American politics, that owning guns is the right way to resist tyranny, which had essentially become dormant in the first half of the 20th century. When was the last time that California or Mississippi sent its militia off into battle, right? That's what the Second Amendment seems to protect as a bulwark against tyranny, but it had become archaic. It was no longer really meaningful. And then the federal government got involved in the fight for desegregation. This is a political earthquake, the aftershocks of which we are still experiencing to this day. One of those aftershocks is this rebirth of the idea of gun ownership as preservative of individual liberty. Frankly, it makes no sense, right? The modern military has such overwhelming firepower that the individual, no matter how heavily armed, is never going to be effective in resisting tyranny. We see this in incidents like Waco, Texas, right? That the government will ultimately overwhelm individuals, even if they are in possession of automatic rifles, body armor, etc. But having said that, it's not really about the reality of resisting government tyranny. It's an expressive identity committed to the idea that the best way to push back against an overreaching federal government is to stand up for individual rights. And one of the most effective ways to do that is to own a gun. And I want to now pivot to this more recent article. This came out just last year from a couple law school authors, actually one of them at UC Berkeley, the other one at UPenn, arguing that this has become a new Republican strategy, right? Whether it's litigating in the name of individual rights in order to turn back federal civil rights efforts, or it's passing legislation like SB 8 in Texas that lets individuals sue in order to protect what they see as their individual counter rights, rights against the government's ability to regulate or the government's ability to promote a civil rights agenda. And this is, again, the tremendous irony of originalism being the underlying philosophy, and yet there's an effort to take exactly what the conservatives and the Federalist Society are so critical of, right? The rights revolution, and now use it as an instrument of conservative politics. So there's a lot there, right? The idea that contemporary gun culture is actually rooted in contemporary race relations, that there are these legal revolutions occurring. And please note, right, that the Supreme Court has become even more conservative since the Heller decision was decided. It seems to me that it is not at all inconceivable that the mistake that was just being criticized, right, the mistake of thinking that rights can't be regulated, would be repeated by the Supreme Court were Congress to pass effective gun control legislation. So with that background in mind, I now want to shift to areas that it seemed to me are at least less blocked in our national political agenda. And I want to start with the idea that there is a severe youth mental health crisis. The Surgeon General in December actually issued a report about this. The last time the Surgeon General of the United States issued a report about a health crisis, it was about the opioid epidemic, right? And so these are rare. It's only when there are genuine public health emergencies that we get these reports. And this is an area, it seems to me, where it's possible to envision more meaningful, perhaps even bipartisan legislation actually passing Congress, being enacted and doing some good. And so let's start with the background, the overall picture of what's happening. And we'll start with children and young adults visiting emergency rooms for self-inflicted injuries. To be as clear as possible, the main scenario here is attempted suicide, right? And as you can see, for the first decade of the current century, there was no clear trend line. It went up and it went down. But since then, since in particular 2009, the trend line has been very clear, and the slope actually alarmingly steep, particularly for girls and young women. And when we try to drill down on what is happening here, one thing stands out in particular as seeming to explain a lot of this, and this is self-reported loneliness and depression among young people. We have 12th graders going all the way back to the 1970s, and then 10th and 8th graders, a little bit more recent data. And as you can see, it's stable or random fluctuations, or even it seems like a downward trend in the first years of this century. And then again, 2009, 2010, 2011, we start seeing this sharp uptick. And so I want to talk about the timing for a second, and we'll get into this more. But 2009 is the depths of the Great Recession, right? And so there's a very strong correlation and convincing causal story to be told about the relationship between familial financial vulnerability and youth mental illness, right? And we'll get into that, but please note the coincidence in these dates. And then the second thing to note is that in or around 2010, we are right on the cusp of the social and digital media revolutions. And so children are reporting loneliness, right? And please note, right, the number of children meeting with their friends every day declines by 50% over this period. And please note also, these data all precede the pandemic, right? These go up to 2016, 2017, not to 2020, right? And so what is happening here is that kids are not getting together physically with each other. And I think we can see more of this as we get into some of the more fine-grained data. I want to say that there are ambivalent trends here, but I think that the most important underlying trend is also the most disturbing trend. So kids are smoking fewer cigarettes, right? The amount of cigarette use is going down substantially. The alcohol use is going down substantially too. Marijuana, as it becomes legalized, it's a little bit more ambivalent. Cocaine use is going steadily down. Even sex and unprotected sex are going down. Now, one thing to say about those three categories is that in a sense, right, childhood smoking, drinking, drug use, and sex are, if you will, social vices. They happen when people get together, right? And part of what we've seen in the previous slide, and we'll double down on now, is that kids aren't getting together as much anymore. And so part of the reason that there's some better data here is in part because kids are the term that psychologists are using here is digitally mediated social relations. They're relating to each other over their phones and computer screens, not in person, right? And so please note two other trends, right? Television watching has gone down 3 hours a day. The number of kids getting 8 hours of sleep a night has gone down by about 50%, right? The thing that has gone up and gone up dramatically is the number of children using a smartphone or a computer or a tablet at least 3 hours a day, not for schoolwork. And please note, right, this diagram, which goes up to 2019, says that it's about 50% of kids. The other data I see suggests it's much higher than that, right? The number of kids spending at least half their waking hours on some sort of digital device seems to be almost that high right now. So if it is more than 3 hours, it's a lot more than 3 hours. And when we look in particular at the signs of the crisis, right, persistent hopelessness or sadness, very high for girls, but also high for boys. Seriously considered suicide, right? Going down, 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 and then up, up, up. Again, it's that 2009 threshold. If you study suicide, you know that the thing that should be really alarming is concrete suicidal ideations, people who are actually making a plan, right? And this is again, going way up for both groups, but especially for women. Attempted suicide going up, but more modestly. Ending up injured from a suicide attempt going up a little bit, right? And so this is the sign that we're in the middle of youth mental health crisis. What's causing this? And I've spoken with you about this before. We've seen an absolute explosion in social media and digital communication over a very short period of time. Please note that none of this existed in 2006, right? When we begin to get YouTube, and it's really only in 2008 that we begin to get Facebook. So again, when I say it's not accidental that 2009, 2010 is when this uptick in youth mental health issues occurs, it's exactly as the social media revolution is taking off. One of the issues here is the very rapid adoption of this new technology. This diagram I like because it shows you how previous technologies, the kinds of technologies that led the Tofflers to write about future shock, happened actually much more gradually, right? Whether we're talking about radio or television or the automobile, there was a 50, 70-year transition period with those technologies. With the new digital media technology, cell phones, and in particular smartphones and their usage, or new forms of social media platforms, these have become ubiquitous in less than a decade. And one of the things about the rate of technological change that I think is very troubling from an anthropological perspective is the faster it occurs, the less time there is for culture to adapt new norms to regulate the new technology, right? And so I'll just mention one of the items that I come across when reading this. The average age that children encounter online pornography for the first time is now 9 years old, right? And the kind of pornography they're encountering online is digital media. It's a film, it's not Playboy, it's not a picture, it's not a centerfold. It is actual intercourse. It is often actually quite violent. And this is something that many parents are not aware of, and it makes it so much more difficult to regulate or guide your child through their maturation process. I'm going to add one more factor, not directly related to this, but I think that should also be in the mix. The age of onset of adolescence, right? And this is a hormonal chemical change that occurs in the body and affects the brain. In boys, it's the lowering of the voice, body hair, etc. And for girls, of course, developing breasts and menstruating has come down. Used to be the age was around 14 to 16 when these changes occurred. It's now around 10 to 13 on average, right? And so it's been pushed back 3 or 4 years. And it's a little hard to understand. It appears it may have a lot to do with the hormones that we're feeding the animals that we eat, that are our meat supply and our dairy supply. But what is clear is that adolescence and the hormonal change it represents doesn't just change the body, it changes the brain chemistry as well. It takes us out of that phase of childhood where we're frankly involved primarily in our imaginary world of play and into a world where we're much more sensitive to pure evaluation, relative standing, and status. And it's very uncomfortable. It's often very difficult for children to manage. It's easier to manage when your executive order thinking is better developed. And executive order thinking has not accelerated in development despite the earlier development of adolescence. And so you have children going through these changes who have not developed the higher level cognitive capacities necessary to cope with it. You then add social media technology, which tends to amplify bullying, a lot more online bullying going on, to make children really focused on an idealized presentation of the self in their social media profiles, using filters, trying to get that perfect post that makes them look to be highly attractive. There is a crucible of new vulnerability that is being created for our children these days, and that is manifest in the youth mental health crisis they're experiencing. The kids, the young people, are the fastest adapters of the new platforms their phones can use. And as you can see, the newer the platform, the younger the demographics of the users using it. And when we look, and I think this is frankly quite outdated at this point, but when we look at the amount of screen time that kids are spending, as I say, for many of them, it is half their waking hours. It used to be only once a day for a substantial share of the younger population. Now, 16% almost constantly, 27% hourly, 70% more than once a day. We have become a social media society, especially for our younger people. And when we look at the diet, right, the media diet of young people, it is dominantly social media, online gaming, digital technology, less traditional television, radio, physical press, books, right? That stuff is contracted to a very small portion of their media diet. I'm now going to shift, and so I've hit one of the two factors that I'm pointing to that make 2009, 2010 such an important threshold in youth mental health. I now want to push to the second one, and that's the economic downturn of 2008, the Great Recession, but to also point out to you that the Great Recession occurs in the context of rapidly increasing social inequality in the United States. I know I've shown you this diagram many times before. It's just a good way of graphically representing how we've moved from being a quite egalitarian society into being a highly stratified or hierarchical society very quickly. And I want to call your attention to a couple books that we've talked about before in other contexts. This book, Scarcity, which is co-authored by a social psychologist and an economist, about, in a sense, what being on the bottom of the economic ladder, in particular, feeling greater precariousness and status consciousness, does to your cognition, right? And it makes it harder to think, harder to solve problems. The metaphor they use is it reduces your cognitive bandwidth. If you've ever been in the situation of wondering how you're going to pay rent or mortgage next month, you probably know that it's very hard not to let that worry, if you're really worried that you're about to become homeless, especially if you have children or others depending on you, it's incredibly difficult not to have that eclipse everything else that you should be thinking about, right? And what we find, of course, is that parenting demands a great deal of empathy, patience, problem solving, imaginatively trying to identify with your child to assist them in learning and figure out if something is troubling them, what is troubling them. We entered a society where many adults have less resources, less time, less of a social foundation for doing the hard work of parenting well. I think it's worthwhile mentioning that the majority of children are now being raised outside of traditional two-parent families where they're getting support from both of their biological parents, right? The number one events that push people into poverty in the United States are first, divorce, and second, having a child. And that in particular, single parents are really struggling financially to support their children. And that doesn't just mean that their children are experiencing economic insecurity, and we know that that can be traumatic and debilitating, but also that they're getting less effective parenting because their parents are debilitated by economic stress. The second book I want to call your attention to, one we've talked about at great length before, is Richard Wilkinson's and Kate Pickett's The Spirit Level. And Wilkinson and Pickett are public health researchers. They're British medical doctors, and they are interested in the public health effects of greater inequality, as well as the more general social effects. And I'm just going to refresh your memory briefly with a few of their diagrams. The first and the kind of synthetic idea here is that more unequal countries have worse, not only health, but also social problems. And you know that this diagram is from a book from 2009. Some things may have changed, but I think the overall correlation here remains strong, which is to say societies that have low income inequality also have a low score on this composite index of health and social problems. This includes life expectancy, school outcomes, infant mortality, but also homicides, mental illness, right? Drug abuse, etc. Right? And as you can see, the United States in particular is the most unequal of these developed societies and also scores worst on the index of health and social problems. If we pull into the stuff that is most relevant for what we're talking about today, there's a clear correlation between income equality and child well-being, or inequality and bad outcomes for children, right? So you can see again, right, the high equality societies have good child well-being scores. This is UNESCO data, UNICEF data. Whereas the more unequal societies have worse scores with regards to child well-being. Something similar is true of mental illness as well. As income inequality goes up, mental illness goes up. We understand very well the causal mechanisms at work here, right? In a more unequal society, there is greater social evaluative threat and status anxiety. You're more concerned that somebody is looking at you to see if your teeth are straight, to judge the clothes you're wearing, to judge which phone you have, what kind of car you drive, where you live. Those markers of relative income and wealth become more important markers of relative social status and position, because the space between social positions is bigger. And so the difference between different status positions matters more to social fate and social standing. As we become more unequal, we experience more anxiety. We produce more cortisol, and it's the worst kind of anxiety. It's constant or chronic anxiety, and it produces mental health problems. Children are very sensitive to it and internalize it from their parents and notice it in their peer groups. This is part of what is going on in addition to the social media revolution that is producing our youth mental health crisis. And when you have young people who are depressed, who are angry, who are lonely, who are bullied, and you have guns, you have a very dangerous mix, especially, and this is where I'll conclude today, when we notice that there are also viral disinformation campaigns that blame scapegoats for the problems that many people are experiencing. And I'm going to return now to the Buffalo shooter for a moment, and point out, right, first of all, that in addition to growing more unequal, we've seen a decline in the life expectancy, in particular, of US white non-Hispanic people, especially people without a college education, right? This is the so-called deaths of despair, the famous study done by Angus Keaton and oh boy, I'm sorry, I've lost my ability to name Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who did this research. And what we're seeing, right, as we've become a post-industrial society, a couple generations now of white working class people, people without a college education, who expected to be economically secure and socially respectable, have seen not only their economic security undermined, but also their sense of social belonging undermined. And this then feeds into the great replacement theory, which of course is what appears to have motivated the Buffalo shooter, right? And so it does not appear that the shooting in Uvalde, Texas was racially motivated, but the shooting in Buffalo clearly was. A man who grew up in a nearly all-white community drove 200 miles to what he thought was the nearest all-black community in order to gun people down. He shot African Americans and spared white people in the Tops grocery store that he went into. And he left what appears to be, it's a little hard to trace the provenance, but at least the biographical as well as the ballistic data match very clearly the profile of the shooter. He left this manifesto. And this is where I'll talk just for a moment, that there is this increasingly viral online community, right, that suggests that white people are in a dog eat dog battle with African Americans and Latinos. In particular, the Buffalo shooter really extended this theory to African Americans as opposed to just immigrants, that if Latinos and African Americans and Asians gain equal rights with whites in our society, they will use them to assert dominance and to subordinate white people. And while this is total madness, obviously cooked up craziness, it is widely circulating, and it is motivating people to come to Charlottesville with Confederate and Nazi flags, to engage in a march that seems like a cross between an SS march and a KKK rally, to kill people in grocery stores in Buffalo, to bring assault rifles to Black Lives Matters protests, to storm the Capitol, right? And so we have this toxic stew of economic insecurity, of youth mental health problems, of unregulated, anarchic, toxic online discourse that is apparently attracting more and more people to political violence. If, as I conclude, we can't get the guns out of people's hands, we need to do what perhaps we can do better: address issues to do with youth mental health, address issues to do with economic insecurity, address issues to do with disinformation and the amplification of affect, the stoking of destructive emotions online. That's where I will stop today. I'm sure you have plenty to say. Who wants to start us off today? Anne, go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. I'm very concerned. I like where you went today on this, but for the same reason that we can't get gun control issues, anything which is going to address the reasons for the inequality is going to be knocked down for the same reason, because we're helping one part of the community that needs help, but it's the part that the white community, this cabal or whatever you want, is going to vote against. So I don't know how we get out of that.
So let me basically agree with you, right? And part of my analysis is to suggest these problems are tangled, right? They interact with each other, they overlap with each other, and they're really hard to solve. But then in the name of, and I want to be as clear as possible, right? When we encounter an event like what happened in Uvalde, Texas, I think the tendency is to be heartbroken and depressed. And how could you not be when you stare into the faces of those young children? But I also think we need to be in equal measures outraged and then organizing, right? And so we have to identify at least the paths of least resistance, not that they're going to be easy paths to take, right? And so one of the things I would point out, right, is that we have had meaningful bipartisan legislation to do with the opioid crisis, right? That this seems to be an issue where people could come together and say, look, we just have a public health emergency. We have a lot of desperate people. They're both Black and white. They're both rural and inner city. Let's do something about it, right? And if we could start the conversation with the youth mental health crisis, which I think is beginning to have similar proportions to the opioid crisis, and is manifesting itself not only in this plague of suicides and attempted suicides, but also in this epidemic of gun violence, it would be a place where we could start saying, what can we do together to ease young people's suffering? And I will readily admit, I don't have a policy prescription here, especially when it comes to the social media stuff. I have a clear idea that they need to be regulated, right? That in particular, both the circulation of disinformation and this escalation of emotion that they clearly give rise to are genuine public health concerns, and we need to be doing something about it. But having said that, exactly what it is, I don't have an easy answer to that. But it does seem to me that that might be the kind of thing where in this highly polarized, highly fractious, very geographically divided era we're in, we nevertheless could say, wait a sec, these are our kids, they're suffering, we need to do something about it. That's my reason for, in a sense, pivoting away from gun control into youth mental health as a way of finding a more constructive, more at least minimally viable path for reform. Flossie, go ahead. Remember, you have to unmute yourself.
I'm thinking of the latest incident in Texas, where an 18-year-old, a kid himself, shot a seated target. Kids like himself, not adults, but a classroom with teachers and kids who were like him, of Latino descent. It could have been avoided if the local merchant who sold him a gun hadn't said something like, what are you going to do, shoot up a classroom? If he picked up a phone and said, there's trouble here.
Yep.
There are certain things that where we can, despite what government and misinformation does, there is a point at which somebody sees trouble and has the courage to say, I've seen something that disturbs me. I'm not being a snitch, but an 18-year-old came into my store today and I sold him not a gun, I sold him a bomb.
Yeah. And look, I completely agree with you, Flossie. I also think we have to put it in context, right? This didn't occur in Northern California or Metro New York City. It occurred in Texas, right? It occurred in rural Texas. It occurred in an area where people buy guns all the time, where it's just a normal aspect of ordinary life. And again, I think if you don't have a good understanding of gun culture, which I really don't, despite the fact that I grew up in rural Northern California, in part in Glen Ellen, there was a gun in my home. There were multiple guns in some of my childhood friends' homes, but this has changed, and it's changed really in the last 20 years, where people are walking around open carry, right? With a gun on a holster when they go out for dinner, when they go to the bar, when they go to the grocery store. People are wearing Smith and Wesson hats and shirts and camouflage pants. That when we say gun culture, we got to recognize this is an entire identity, a social as well as a political or cultural identity that people have embraced. And so let us hope, that there are some merchants who, if they really suspect that somebody they're selling a gun to is a dangerous individual, have some kind of intervention. But having said that, if you don't sell the gun, he's going to go to the next gun seller. In Texas, there aren't so-called red flag laws, right, which allow you to pick up the phone and call somebody and then the police to go take the gun away. In a sense, we need reform. We're not going to get it, right? But we need reform to be able to envision the scenario you're talking about being an effective, or even better, reliable way of preventing these incidents. I'll say two more things here. The number one cause of death in the United States for people 24 years old or younger is gun violence, right? Number one cause of death for children and young adults. And it happens 54 times a week, right? This is the world we're dealing with. And I hate to say it. I mean, this will be the first time I'm mentioning the NRA today. I deliberately stayed away from them, right? But their lobby is so powerful. But it's not just their lobby. It's that they have fomented a cultural revolution in rural America that identifies maturity, agency, individual freedom with gun ownership. That's going to be really hard to overcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry to push back so hard, but I do think it is, you got to be clear-eyed about what you're facing. Anybody else, or did I just throw a bath of cold water on the whole conversation? I'm sorry.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. David, are you raising your hand? Go ahead.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Great. I wanted to move to another issue on the income equality issue, because it's my personal view that that's probably the core issue, is the increasing disparity across SES categories. But I think what's happened is that the rich conservative intelligentsia managed to carry along poor whites on issues that have to do with cultural wars and, of course, gun control and things like that. And they carry them along also on the income discrepancy issues, and they think it's just fine that there are these discrepancies amongst folks, because it depends on how hard you work. I mean, you get what you pay for, in a sense. My father was a working class guy his whole life, grew up in the Depression, hated FDR. And the reason he hated FDR is that he preferred laws and approaches to government that were minimalist, because he imagined himself a millionaire. And it was only circumstance. And he didn't get this job or didn't get that job that prevented him from becoming one. But if he had become one, he would have wanted a government that didn't interfere with any of his business, and so voted conservative his whole life. I lived in Minnesota for 12 years in the 60s, and during the days of Hubert Humphrey and Gene McCarthy and Walter Mondale. And it was an incredible political setting, because they had the Democratic Party there was called the DFL, Democratic Farmer Labor Party. By 2016, the Democratic Party had lost both farmers and laborers. And the reason we're in the trouble we are today is that we don't seem to be able to appeal, at least one of the reasons is that we cannot seem to appeal to those two segments of the population, both of whom, if they were on the Democratic side, would help not only with all kinds of legislation, but mainly, I think, with legislation to ease the income inequality. That's.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm sorry, I muted you right at the end just because we're getting a lot of echo or feedback. If you've got anything more to say, please do unmute yourself. But having said that, I was with you all the way till the very end. And then I think it's just worthwhile noting that farmers have become a negligible portion of the overall population, right? And so yes, labor, but labor has become so economically insecure, it's not unionized, it's not regularly employed. And so some of what has changed is the actual structure of our economy that made it easier to have a Democratic Farmer Labor Party succeed politically, right? But then I think we need to add two more things. I think you're spot on in saying that the Republican Party has been through most of the 20th century, after its oligarchic capture at the end of the 19th century, this very unstable composite of rich business interests and more populist individual freedom, often poor interest, right? And we see this in the Tea Party and Trump, that populism may be starting to get the upper hand in ways that are in certain respects hostile to some of those more oligarchic or hyper wealthy interests. Having said all of that, I think we also have to be careful in assuming that people are just befuddled or bamboozled or confused about their interests, as opposed to thinking that people sometimes don't vote for their material interests, right? And so you describe your father as a would-be millionaire, right? And I think much more typical of poor people voting Republican today, economically precarious or insecure, resentful people voting Republican today, is not so much that they think they're potential millionaires, but they think that they have got what they made through hard work, right? And they resent anybody who they think is getting ahead of them through handouts or government assistance, right? And so they're trying to scale back government because they have a self-conception that says, I deserve what I got, and all those other people are non-deserving and yet ending up ahead of me. And I think in a sense, we have to be able to hit head on that double confusion, right? You know, nobody gets what they get through sheer hard work and desert, right? Everybody is the beneficiary of good luck, or else the victim of bad luck in addition to that, right? But also supported by all kinds of social programs, which are the primary reason we have a white middle class in this society to begin with. And by the way, the majority of the beneficiaries of welfare and of other kinds of social support in our society in 2022 are still white people, even though they're often voting against the programs that benefit them, right? And so being able to tell that more complex story is essential to being able to begin to make some headway. It's not just that you're being stupidly self-destructive, don't you get it? Or that you're showing a lack of solidarity. You have been fed a deeply misleading story about how opportunity works and who the government assists and who it works for. And please note, whenever people fall for a bill of goods being sold to them, it's in part because it has a little bit of plausibility to it. And the idea that we've become so unequal and that the deck is so stacked against so many of us leads us to look for these kind of simple explanations, and then to just get things tangled up again. You'll find plenty of those simple explanations, not only on AM talk radio or Fox News, but also in social media.
Yeah.
All right, anybody else? We're coming up on an hour and a half. Maybe we should call it a day. I do hope you'll be out from under isolation pretty soon, that you'll continue to take care of yourselves, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys next week. Okay, take care, everybody. Thanks. Bye-bye.